With our usual 5-minute lag, I'd like to reconvene. We are shifting gears not so much in subject or intent, but in publication and specific application. As many of you are aware, there is now a already legendary Franco-German economists report. This report has been the subject of extensive press in Europe, most of it favorable, even from some surprising places. This report has been presented in workshops and advising sessions in Berlin, in Brussels, in Paris, and occasionally in other countries that the Franco-German authors pretend to care about. But most importantly, this report is, as mentioned repeatedly through today, is grasping the philosophical nettle of how do you reconcile a political view of the economy and the economic problems in Europe as the result of moral hazard or lack of discipline with a belief that there has to be additional capacity in Central Europe, or at least central to the Euro area, to deal with shocks. And this can be caricatured as a German versus French debate. That's not fair to anyone involved, but that is a useful shorthand at times. And so my colleagues, Nicolas, Véron, and Jeromin Zettelmeyer, among a whole distinguished list of friends and former colleagues and future colleagues, and basically the great and the good of European applied finance and macroeconomics of their generation, came together to write this report. And in particular, I want to call out our senior fellow, Jeromin Zettelmeyer, who has been with us full-time since September 2016 after serving as Director General for Economic Policy at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs, for showing real leadership in fashioning this report. I have to admit, because I want to give Jeromin the full credit he deserves, although Nicolas and the many other co-authors, of course, mattered greatly as well. When Jeromin first told me he was undertaking this, I was supportive but skeptical. He and I had been involved, or rather I had gotten him involved 5-6 years ago in a similar project that took a lot of effort, involved many of the same brilliant people, and ended up not going anywhere. But in the spirit of one of the lessons that Jacob and I identified that I mentioned earlier today, if you have a good idea about European integration, you have to be prepared to bring it forward, apply it anew, not accept the first rejection. And Jeromin and Nicolas and the co-authors, to their credit, did that. And they have caught the moment of Macron and Merkel and Juncker and, excuse me, terribly sorry, and are making a difference. And so we're delighted to have Jeromin present the overall report. Nicolas Véron, also a senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute, has been affiliated with us since October 2009, one of the co-founders of Bruegel, where he remains a senior fellow as well. As Anna mentioned, an engineer by training, which means prepared for the elite in France. And in disclosure, has since July 2013 been a board member of the derivatives arm of the DTCC, a global financial infrastructure company, but also perhaps the leading expert on practical matters of European banking union and capital markets union to come. They're going to take us through the report and through its recommendations, and then we're very fortunate to have with us Mahmood Pradhan. And let me say how grateful I am to Mahmood for making time to speak. This will be, in addition to essentially the American rollout of this report, this also becomes the occasion for the IMF's European department, of which Mahmood is currently the deputy director, to offer some comments and reflections on both the Franco-German report, its initiatives, the assessment behind it, but also where the IMF European department, which has played such a critical role in the health of Europe and the world economy in the last decade, where they think things are going. Mahmood is a senior person at the fund, obviously. He was previously senior advisor in the Asia Pacific department, and prior to that, actually, had been global head of emerging market research at Deutsche Bank. So he's been inside the belly of the beast in two beasts. So let me now turn it over to Jeromin. Please take us through, and you'll notice we have both a German and a French economist to present this report.
Thank you so much, Adam. I'm really delighted. I hope my presentation is going to come at some point. But in the meantime, let me just say that I am, in some sense, I was as surprised as Adam that we actually managed to pull this thing together. So I gave it maybe a 30% chance of success, and you can see that from the fact that the place where I store this report on my hard drive is called Franco-German Attempt New. And it follows an existing directory, which is just called Franco-German Attempt, and the first one failed. Right? The first one was actually an attempt that I did with Philippe Martin, who is a co-author of our new report, while he was advising then Minister of Economic Affairs Macron, and I was advising the German Minister for Economic Affairs, and so we tried to do something similar, but we didn't get very far. Okay, so I'm going to be discussing this report, and as you can see, there's quite a lot of CEPR branding there, and so I've circled the Peterson Institute things just to offset the. So we chose the CEPR as a publication outlet after some debate because it was sort of neutral territory between France and Germany. It's published in London. But also because it's a network, not a think tank, and we thought it would be a good publication outlet for that without giving any of our individual institutions an advantage. Just to give you a sense, I have 6 slides from now on. So my first slide is what are we actually trying to do in this report? And so, mainly, and, this is to some extent a personal rendering of what we are trying to do. It's about 2 things. It's first about a problem that I think most people in this room will agree exists, which is underdeveloped private and public risk sharing in the euro area. And so that shows up on the private side in the form of limited financial integration, particularly limited capital market integration, and on the public side, under the rubric of lack of fiscal stabilization tools. And while it is, somewhat debatable how significant these tools are within the US, they are certainly much more important than they are within Europe right now, where the only, if you like, quasi-fiscal tool is the ESM, since the EU budget is largely intended for structural purposes, not for stabilization purposes. But then there's the second motivation, which for me is almost more important or just as important as the first one, which is that we have a very inefficient and divisive approach to maintaining fiscal discipline. So we put almost exclusive emphasis on rules that have been, including by observers at the IMF, correctly, in my view, criticized as error-prone, pro-cyclical, so not very friendly to stabilization, very complex, which means that you then need, if you like, the interpretation, the micromanagement from the European Commission to enforce them and interpret them. And they're also hard to enforce in the sense that they rely on sanctions, penalties that are probably not very credible, because they're based on this idea that members of the European Union will hurt each other after the fact, after a fiscal sin has been committed, and that's not time consistent. At the same time, there's a second anchor, if you like, of fiscal discipline in the European Treaty, which is the so-called no bailout clause, and this has not been effectively enforced. And as a result, the little bit of, if you like, market discipline that is in the system has not been used very much, and the consequence is that we need to overly rely on these rules that are divisive. But there's an even bigger consequence, and this is usually the way I try to sell a little bit of sympathy for the no bailout rule to my left-wing friends, if you really have no means in the system to actually go through with a debt restructuring when debts are truly unsustainable, you get into extremely inefficient and socially and politically costly forms of crisis management. Because what you're trying to do then is to effectively cure a sustainability problem, a solvency problem, through some mixture of financing and very, very, very deep adjustment. And that adjustment, by definition, because I've assumed this was unsustainable, turns out to be futile, exposed. And so Greece, for me, is an example for that. And of course, that type of experience can be hugely divisive, right? So it upsets the Greeks enormously because they bear most of the economic costs of such an episode, but then it also upsets some of the populations in the creditor countries who say, look, we're never going to get this money back from Greece. So we want to address both of these problems, and so that raises this really critical question whether we can, if you like, address problem number one, which is about creating more risk sharing without at the same time hurting problem number two further, by making the, undermining discipline, making the incentives problems even bigger than they are now. So is there a trade-off, and are we, if you like, at the efficient frontier in that trade-off? And so our answer to can we improve risk sharing without undermining discipline is emphatically yes in this report. And the point here, so if you like, the intellectual innovation of the report is that not only do we say, look, we're not nearly at the efficient frontier, but we would even argue that in some sense, which I'm going to make more precise, there is no trade-off. There's no trade-off at all, because properly designed risk-sharing arrangements actually improve discipline. And specifically in this context, this is, I think, a general fact in economics, but in this context, through the channel that they will make the no bailout rule easier to enforce. And so this is a point that was nicely made both by Randy and by Helge Berger in the first session. Okay, so how do we propose then to fix this in practice? Well, and here's where the report gets pretty European. So we don't have the one sort of grand solution. We have a collection of, if you like, little or medium little stuff. But individually, some of these things are quite a big departure from where we are now, and collectively they make up a very big departure indeed. And so the first component is we do not propose to abolish fiscal rules. We want to just improve them, reform them, make them less error-prone, less procyclical, and easier to enforce. We do see a targeted role for market discipline. So this is not that we now really want to throw countries to the mercy of the markets, but it's a very specific role supported by institutions. And basically, it just amounts to 2 points. One is we propose a way of enforcing the fiscal rule that ditches sanctions and instead tells countries, well, if you want to violate the fiscal rule, that's okay, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt, but you have to finance your violation using subordinated bonds. And so if markets believe your story, which is that you had a good reason to violate the rule, then you're going to be issuing these bonds at a low cost, and if not, then there is a penalty. So in that sense, we advocate a small role for market discipline in the context of the surveillance framework. And then we want this role for market discipline, if you like, as an absolutely last resort. So something that you would not normally observe, and that is to effectively open the option for debt restructuring as a last resort when debt is indeed unsustainable. Not outside that situation. So we are not saying that ESM lending per se is a violation of the no bailout rule. Far from it. Then what are the risk-sharing devices that we propose to make this more credible? And so effectively there are 4 components here, 4 ideas. One, and arguably the most important one, is financial sector reform. So this is what Nicolas will be talking about after me. We have an idea for a fiscal capacity, which is a type of rainy day fund, which you could interpret it as a form of European unemployment insurance. it embeds a European unemployment insurance, if you like. We want to make it easier to access the ESM for countries that pursue reasonable policies in normal times. Right now, to access the ESM, you basically need a crisis that threatens the integrity of the euro. And we think it should be easier to use the ESM in a precautionary way. And then finally, we have some discussion, and if you like, a more cautious proposal to introduce a so-called safe asset based on a diversified sovereign debt portfolio. And so here the idea is that, since we do not have a single sovereign issuer that dominates the system, and because we believe that diversification is good, that we think that proposals such as the so-called European senior bonds idea of Markus Brunnermeier and his co-authors, that's recently been explored by a task force of the European Systemic Risk Board, they deserve serious consideration as an alternative for banks who want to hold sovereign exposures, but we think they should be held in a more diversified and in a safer form. And finally, we have some ideas on strengthening institutions, and they are basically the two key ones is that we would like a much stronger national role in the actual implementation of the fiscal rules and the surveillance over the fiscal rules. So this goes in the same direction as ideas that have been for some time advocated by the European Commission. We think national fiscal councils should have a strong role. We also think that there is a case for better separating the watchdog and the political decision-maker function inside the European Commission. And finally, we have some ideas for ESM reform. So I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm just going to give you one slide on the three things that are circled now, which is the reform of fiscal rules, what we actually mean by saying that the no bailout rules should become more credible, why we say that and how we want to achieve that, and finally, just a brief slide on our unemployment reinsurance fund. Okay, so the idea with respect to the fiscal rule is that we propose to have a system of national fiscal councils supervised by a euro area watchdog that would define a medium term, for example, 5-year debt reduction target, and the ambitiousness of that target, which is expressed as a debt reduction as a share of GDP, would depend both on the distance from the Maastricht ideal, which is, by the way, I was told recently in a presentation in Germany this wasn't the ideal, this was the upper bound. But anyway, we propose to use the 60% debt to GDP ratio as a long-term target, but also give some consideration to broader fiscal solvency considerations. So, for example, a country like Italy, which has done very significant pension reform, and so its long-run sustainability situation arguably looks better than that of Germany, should be given credit for something like that. Now, after you have established this debt reduction target, you would come up with a medium-term nominal growth projection based on an estimate of potential, the inflation target of the ECB, and possibly, if you start in a recession, a cyclical correction. And these two elements then give you what you need to back out an expenditure growth ceiling, which is consistent with reaching your medium-term debt reduction target. They do that because the revenues projection that you need is implicit in the nominal growth projection. So the simplest case for such a expenditure growth ceiling would be a rule that says expenditure cannot grow more than the expected nominal growth rate. Right? Now, very importantly, for such a rule to work, to be, dare I say the word, immune to moral hazard, you need someone who makes sure that the government cannot undermine it through discretionary changes in the tax system, right? So if you have a big tax cut ahead of an election, for example, that's fine, that's totally fine. So governments obviously should have, and parliaments particularly, the prerogative to control the size of government, but it would need to be then taken out of the expenditure ceiling when this happens. Now, the important thing here is that any Non-discretionary changes in taxes are not taken out of the expenditure ceiling. And so this is what really drives the main advantage of this type of rule relative to what we have now. So if you have a situation where your economy is collapsing and revenue collapses because of that, then the expenditure growth rule does not get revised. The ceiling does not get revised. So basically you would just sit there and accept the increase in the deficit that comes through the cyclical development. Conversely, if you have a situation like we had in the 2000s in Europe, where you have revenue buoyancy, the expenditure ceiling also doesn't get revised. So you would really be forced to save the windfall expenditure growth, right? So it's less cyclical, both on the upswing and on the downswing. And then finally, like I mentioned, we proposed that to enforce this type of rule by committing governments through an EU regulation to finance expenditure in excess of the ceiling through subordinated bonds, which would then be, treated differently for normal bonds in various ways. They would suffer an automatic maturity extension in the case of ESM programs, unlike normal bonds. They would receive a different regulatory treatment if held by banks, one that essentially dissuades banks from holding that. And then in exchange, the present sanctioning system would be abolished. Okay, now let me move to the idea of taking the no bailout rule more seriously. And so I don't just want to tell you, given skepticism in this room of whether we are excessively obsessed with this, of how we want to do it, but also why. And so let me sort of go back to the basics. So the basics are that the premise for this whole thing. And by the way, points 1, 2, 3 in this chain of argument are taken straight from the European treaties, or the Maastricht concept. Number 4 is, if you like, a Germanic point, and number 5 is, if you like, the enlightened economists, or maybe the Southern economists' way of handling point 4. So the really new thing comes in at the end of this slide. But anyway, the initial premise is that fiscal externalities are in fact important in a currency union, and they are so through 2 channels. One is the channel that probably was the motivation for the prohibition of monetary financing and for the original Maastricht fiscal rules construct in the first place, which is this notion that one really has to avoid fiscal dominance, right? So if you want an independent central bank, the idea is if you allow countries to build up large debts, there's going to be pressure to monetize this debt. Now, in my view, there's an even more important externality, which is breakup risk. And so here, this is the point where I sort of slightly disagree with what Adam said at the beginning. So the point I want to make here is that this breakup risk, which is that a fiscal crisis in one country that's not properly handled can threaten the integrity of the currency union as a whole. This is a much bigger deal in the euro area than in the US. Because in the US, breakup risk is really not an issue because the dollar is backstopped by the US political union. Right? No one ever thinks of breakup of the US currency into currencies that are issued at the states level. But in Europe, this is a very serious point. And so, regardless of whether you think that breakup risk is driven by bad behavior of member states or simply by large accidents, you need a system that minimizes the fiscal externalities through this channel. Okay, so that system is primarily the fiscal rules and softer coordination devices that we have right now. But absent full fiscal union, we know that these fiscal rules are not sufficient, even in the improved form that we have to really control the externalities. And so, as long as we don't move to this full fiscal union, as long as we are in this messy middle, we need a fallback position, an anchor, if you like, in case fiscal coordination fails. And this is the role of the no bailout clause. But the no bailout clause is going to be empty, not credible, if sovereign debt actually is not restructured when it should be restructured. And that has been the case so far with the most obvious case, Greece, which was eventually restructured, but only after the damage was done. And so, this is the approach of the report. You need a financial architecture which limits the disruptions of debt restructuring on the debtor in other countries, including by reducing bank exposures to their own sovereign and through adequate risk sharing and other stabilization mechanisms to make the no bailout commitment actually credible. And so what I want to really draw your attention to is that, point 5 is a radical departure from the usual approach to, getting a more credible no bailout rule, right? The usual approach is let's create commitment devices which are really, really tough and hard to break. For example, automatic debt restructuring in some cases. So we do not go that route for many reasons, because it would be destabilizing, because you then get errors, which we call type 2 errors. So, you force countries into restructuring when it's not appropriate, but mainly because we think that, these types of hard commitment devices, when push really comes to shoves, are not credible, right? You can change rules. And so if you want to be really effective in following through on, a no bailout principle, you have to do it by reducing the cost of actually living by that principle. Right? That is the key idea. Okay, I'm almost out of time. Just one slide on the reinsurance fund. So we have if you like, a rainy day fund for large shocks. So one way of thinking about this is that it's an application of Jacob's idea from the first session of really pushing earmarked revenues, right? So these would be contributions earmarked for a specific purpose, namely to deliver large payouts to countries that are members of this arrangement, but only if the size of the shock exceeds a preset level. So they have a reinsurance characteristics, more or less. Moreover, you could limit membership in this club to countries that adhere to some minimal standard of good policies. And finally, you can change the rate of contribution depending on the underlying risk in that country. So, and particularly the more volatile the variable is that triggers the payout, for example, unemployment, the higher the national contribution would be. And that feature enables you to implement this without actually leading to a permanent transfer, right? So it's not a loan, it's a genuine insurance arrangement. You're not expected to repay, but it's one that is fair, the way that an insurance is fair, right? So insurances are commercial propositions because they eventually get their money back and because risk is shared. And so we are preserving incentives through this combination of pre-qualification, the reinsurance character of the scheme, and an experience-rated contribution. So conclusion, what's really new about what we are proposing? There's a lot of it is not new, particularly in the individual components. But I think the new thing is this concept, at least in the context of this policy debate, that we need more risk sharing as a condition for better discipline. Right? So it's not a trade-off. It can be a trade-off if you design risk sharing institutions poorly. But the way we are proposing it, these things are complements, not substitutes. And then finally, we think there is some value in individual proposals where we really try to reconcile moral hazard concerns from one side of the European spectrum and financial stability concerns. And that is, you will see this in the design of specific proposals, particularly the one that's going to be introduced by Nicolas next. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think Jeromin gave you a sense of that, and I want to emphasize it even further, that this was a very rewarding exercise for the 14 individuals involved in it. And there was, I think, a common mindset that led us to bring up things that we think are new, particularly in the area I will present, design for deposit insurance. So I will focus on the part about financial sector aspects, which is really centered on this idea of completing banking union. I put quote marks, and I will explain why in a minute. Jeffrey, particularly this morning, gave a sense, I think, of why banking union is so important in the range of reforms that have been adopted in the Eurozone since the beginning of the crisis. And the reason is that really we had, during the Eurozone crisis, a dramatic fragmentation of the financial space. And I think if you relate this with what we discussed this morning about the story of US banking union and the like, the key point, and here I will relate it to what Caroline said about, okay, the US didn't really have a banking union, but it did have a single financial system through the capital markets. The key point in Europe is that we don't have that, not looking at the old history before World War I, but we have a system that is critically reliant on banks. And when the banking system fragmented during the crisis, that was really a deadly risk for the integrity of the euro area, including the risk of breakup. So if you think that, a house divided against itself cannot stand, our problem, the house was divided against itself because of the fragmentation of the financial market. And this was essentially a function of the bank sovereign vicious circle at the national level, and therefore to be addressed with banking union. So this is, this piece of work, so the financial sector section in the Franco-German Euro report is something I worked a lot on, but I think one person who deserves particularly credit in the elaboration of these proposals is also Isabel Schnabel, one of the co-authors, and I want to give her credit here for that. So I guess most of this audience is familiar with banking union. I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing what banking union is and where we are so far. It is important, however, to remember that breaking the vicious circle between banks and sovereigns was the stated intent of the euro area leaders when they started banking union in mid-2012. So the famous, at least in our circles, famous first sentence of the Euro Area Summit statement of June 29, 2012 was, we affirm that it is imperative to break the vicious circle between banks and sovereigns. And importantly, this doom loop was characterized at the national level. So they were not talking about a Euro area-wide vicious circle between the Euro area as a quasi-sovereign and Euro area banks. It was really national fragmentation they had in mind. So this is to Caroline, who said earlier today that there is still a bit of a doom loop in the US, but I think what she meant was a national doom loop at the federal level. What there is not in the US, and that was our paper with Anna, is at this point is a doom loop at the state level. And this is where the fragmentation risk is prominent and what has been so damaging. So I would say there is a circle between banks and sovereigns in any jurisdiction. There is a bank-sovereign nexus in any jurisdiction. But the Eurozone is where it becomes a vicious circle, when it becomes toxic and something that can destroy the policy framework. So we have the single supervisory mechanisms that's centered on the ECB. As Anna mentioned, it's in some aspects more centralized than in the US because we only have a Eurozone level charter. We no longer have national banking charters in Europe, in the Eurozone, sorry, even for small banks. And so that's a pretty complete thing, at least in many of its aspects. We also have a single resolution mechanism, which is much more of a work in progress. There is a very interesting recent report from the European Court of Auditors. But again, my purpose here is not to assess this, it's more to talk about the economics of the bank sovereign vicious circle and to keep in mind that we have a number of linkages between sovereigns and banks, and some of them are direct, some of them are indirect. So indirect linkages are macroeconomic linkages through the economy. But the existence of those indirect linkages should not make us forget that the direct linkages are very real. And the direct linkages are the guarantees, whether implicit or explicit, of sovereigns to banks. So when banks have a problem, it creates contagion to the sovereign credit. So that's why the arrow is in that direction. And conversely, the very large home bias, very high home bias in terms of the Eurozone banks' sovereign exposures to Eurozone member states. So these are the critical linkages directly between banks and sovereigns that we try to address. And when you think of banking union so far, they haven't changed that much in that space. They have reduced some implicit guarantees of the sovereigns over the banks, but not the explicit ones through deposit insurance. There's an additional aspect that we mentioned in the paper with Anna in the past for the US, and which I should mention for Europe, which is direct state ownership of banks, but that's more limited. In a way, it's missing from this chart. It's very significant, for example, in Germany, but not that much if you look at the Eurozone level aggregate. And the point here is that banking union is stalled if you think of reducing those linkages at the national level. There is a commitment from late 2013 in written form to create a fiscal or quasi-fiscal backstop to the Single Resolution Fund, which is part of the Single Resolution Mechanism at the European level or at the Eurozone level. The obvious way to do it would be through the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism. But since late 2013, this discussion has made basically no progress. There is a proposal from the European Commission and actually an agreement of all EU institutions, ECB, Presidency of the Council, Presidency of the ESM, Presidency of the European Parliament, and of course the European Commission to create a European deposit insurance. That's in the so-called Five Presidents report. But the European Commission made a proposal more than 2 years ago. It's a good proposal, but there has been no progress in the legislative process. On sovereign exposures, which I mentioned as a very important channel of transmission of risk at the national level between banks and sovereigns, there is a complete deadlock at this point in the conversation because there are some member states which believe that it's absolutely important for them to be able to have a special role for domestic banks, which, by the way, is completely contradictory with the very notion of a banking union, so that domestic banks, to coin an expression, have a specific shock-absorbing role in terms of buying the sovereign debt of the corresponding member state, especially when there is distress in the sovereign debt market. So this view of domestic banks as a national shock absorber, of course, is true, plays a role in the liquidity of sovereign debt markets in the Eurozone, but it's also a problem from a banking union perspective. And that's why there has been no progress in the conversation about reducing or eliminating the home bias in Eurozone banks, Eurozone sovereign exposures. And of course, there are lots of arguments. Many of you are familiar about legacy, non-performing loans, high levels of sovereign debt are sometimes also put into that bucket. So what do we propose? We propose to accelerate, first acknowledge, but also accelerate progress on restoring banking system soundness. So that's the legacy piece. It's basically, to put a long story short, addressing all the stock of non-performing loans. We know that this is very variable across countries. There's a big issue in Italy. We actually believe that a lot has already been done, so it's, at least as I would put it, mostly a case of continuing the good job that the ECB in particular is currently doing. There was an allusion this morning to the fact that the ECB and the Italian authorities don't seem to see completely eye to eye on this, but ultimately the ECB prevails because, as I mentioned, the legal framework of the single supervisory mechanism is very strong. So this is essentially continuing what is already done, also maybe some new initiatives, but not game changers. Whereas there is a game changer in our proposals is in breaking the bank sovereign vicious circle. And here, we have, in a way, a grand bargain within the grand bargain. It's not a little bargain because it's actually a big deal, but it's focused on the banking sector aspects. And we have this general philosophy of reconciling market discipline with risk sharing. So if you want to simplify, the risk sharing piece is a common deposit insurance. The market discipline piece is what we call sovereign concentration charges. And I will explain in a second what that means. In order to forcibly reduce the home bias in Eurozone banks, Eurozone sovereign exposures. And then we have the Capital Markets Union, which obviously is very important to reach the kind of balance that Caroline was talking about in terms of the US. But here we're modest because we also know that this is not going to happen anytime soon. So it's a very long-term agenda to create a more vibrant financial market, more integrated, more developed in the Eurozone or actually in the European Union. But even with Brexit as a catalyst, and I think in a way Brexit can be a catalyst of that, it's going to be a long-term project. So it can be started with things like strengthening the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA, but it's not going to be like pre-World War I anytime soon, as Caroline reminded us at that time we had very vibrant capital markets in continental Europe, but it will take time to get back to that point. So the rest of my presentation is really focused on the middle bullet point, the balance between sovereign concentration charges and a smart design for EDIS, the European Deposit Insurance Scheme. And here the balance is really both substantial and political. So the political piece is quite obvious. The Germans are enthusiastic about sovereign exposure limitation, but don't like EDIS. The converse for Italians, with France in the middle. So the French co-authors of the report had to play a bit Italian for the balance of the discussion, if you will. So what are they? Sovereign concentration charges are there explicitly to reduce concentrated sovereign exposures in Eurozone banks. Importantly, they're not there to address credit risk associated with sovereign exposures. So we completely differentiate, and this is also now, as I understand it, the position of the European Central Bank, for example, in this debate, including in the Basel Committee for the aficionados. We differentiate between sovereign credit risk and sovereign concentration risk. And the instrument which is proposed, which is a Pillar 1 instrument, which means in the jargon that it's binding on all banks, equally for all banks, is focused on concentration risk. If you have a diversified portfolio of sovereign exposures, you don't get an additional capital charge. If you have concentrated sovereign exposures, you do get a capital charge which increases with concentration. The specifics are in a paper that I wrote for the European Parliament and which we refer to in the joint paper. I'm not going to spend time on them here, but the point is really diversification. And the corollary of this is that this is not going to limit, in practical terms, the aggregate Eurozone sovereign exposures of Eurozone banks. So again, if you think of a bank sovereign linkage at the Eurozone level, we don't touch that. We don't limit that. So aggregate Eurozone sovereign exposures should not be changed by that, or at least we don't expect them to be. But what is changed is at the individual country level, especially for the home country. And of course, a lot of the discussion is about specific calibration, transitional arrangements, and the like, and there are specific proposals in the paper about this as well. The flip side is the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, the smart design, if you will, for EDIS. And here we have something which is really novel in the debate, which is this idea that we would have a deposit insurance scheme which is country blind from the perspective of the insured depositors, but not from the perspective of the bank. So we have a fully integrated institutional framework which really embeds, hardwired in the institutional construct, building up the existing institutions on the existing institutions of banking union, that really the Cypriot or Greek depositor will be treated exactly the same as the Finnish or German depositor, cannot be taken hostage to individual politics. So whatever the bad behavior of the government at the time, the deposit insurance is not in the hands of the finance minister. It can be Mr. Varoufakis or whoever. It's going to be delivered on no matter what. And this is crucial for trust. But at the same time, we recognize that national policies have an influence on the risk in the system. And therefore, if you think of the banks that contribute to the system, the deposit insurance fee, it's very dependent on national policies and national structures. It's not dependent on national sovereign credit, so it's disconnected from the bank sovereign vicious circle. But it is country dependent. And this in turn is key to cross-border banking system integration, because if we have that, particularly because the deposit insurance institutional scheme is integrated, we can dismantle what still exists a lot, which is geographical ring fencing or specific requirements for capital and liquidity at the national entity level in pan-European banking groups, which currently prevents cross-border banking integration, cross-border M&A in the system. So let me conclude. Is this a complete banking union? Of course not. Banking union is a secular project. I'm not sure it will take 200 years, but it will take more than that. But this would achieve a lot, basically the heavy lifting in terms of breaking the bank sovereign vicious circle, or at least the direct linkages, and then enabling more cross-border banking consolidation, which in itself would contribute to breaking even the indirect linkages, the macroeconomic linkages that I had in the chart at the beginning of my presentation. So if you think in terms of redenomination risk, to echo what Jeromin was saying before, what you want is really to remove the risk of a breakup or even a timeout. You want to be able to enable default of a sovereign country inside the Eurozone. This is absolutely crucial. And it is a major step towards that objective. It doesn't completely eliminate redenomination risk because that's inherently impossible, but it would be a major breakthrough. And of course, it would lead to more market integration in the banking system. If you want a completely seamless, borderless market, you need more. You need more on business conduct. You need more on capital markets union, on bankruptcy law, housing finance, you name it. But in terms of the limited objective of banking union, of breaking the bank sovereign vicious circles, this is very significant. Let me conclude inevitably with the lessons from the US and go back to Anna's last slide on what we found in our joint paper. The possibility of reversal. At this point, banking union is a halfway house. It is absolutely possible to envisage a scenario in which even the strong single supervisory mechanisms that we currently have would be reversed by European politics if we don't get to the next step. And this may sound paranoid, but we really don't think it is. We think this is a very real risk if you take a long-term view. The possibility of arbitrage, there is a very clear possibility of arbitrage in the current construct, which is the differentiation between small banks and large banks in the way banking union is constructed. So, for example, if you look at our deposit insurance, or indeed the sovereign concentration charges, the paper makes it clear that they should be for small banks as well as large banks. And finally, the need for incremental adjustment and gradual repair of the system. We also have proposals in the paper, which I haven't developed now for lack of time, in terms of improving the single resolution mechanism, which is probably the least functional of the current pieces of banking union as they exist, in the same spirit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam, for inviting me, and thank you to the authors. Let me start by saying that this kind of invitation made me read the paper much more closely, so that's a plus. Although, as Jeromin and Nicolas both know, we've been involved in these debates for a long time, so a lot of it is familiar. Let me start by saying that there's a lot in this paper that I agree with, okay? In particular, I fully subscribe to the direction of travel, where you're heading and what the kind of reform areas you're looking at. And secondly, what I would say one of the central tenets of the paper of reconciling risk sharing with market discipline, we would fully subscribe to. So that's really kind of it. So a lot of my observations or comments will be on some of the details where we have questions. But I want you to bear in mind that caveat. And I'm going to give you the bottom line here first of my general take on this paper. In terms of the balance between more risk sharing and more market discipline, I think this paper sways too much towards market discipline, and I will explain that as I go along with some of the observations that I have on some of the specifics in the paper, okay? And I also want you to bear in mind, for those of you who may not have read the paper, that in terms of what is likely to be accepted by a collection of Euro area member states in the ideas that are put forward in this paper, the paper you start by saying that you really want to reduce resentment against EU institutions that has been built up for all kinds of reasons that you explain well. You want to raise trust, and you claim that this resentment may have contributed, and I know this is not my area of expertise either, but may have contributed to the rise of populism that we see in some countries. I want to hold you to that and ask you, when I give you some more detailed observations on the specifics, of will some of your proposals sit well with that test that you pose for yourself? Okay. Let me start with a couple of general areas. As a general caveat, I remind you, I agree with many of the ideas, the direction of travel, the reform ideas, etc. So let me start with another area that I fully agree with, that the euro area still remains vulnerable. Some of the crisis legacies have not been addressed, and there are still underlying fragilities. In particular, the sovereign bank links that you emphasize a lot in the paper, they're still there. I would add to that we may be guilty, all of us collectively, of focusing too much on just the sovereign bank links. When we look at high debt levels, we really do need to bear in mind that some of this large debt is held outside the banks. And that is not riskless, and I'll come back to why I make this point now. Okay. The second area that I agree with that leaves us vulnerable is the lack of fiscal space and policy buffers. In the next downturn, we will again be challenged. Okay, this is a message that we have emphasized a lot, especially for countries where debt is still high. And also a reminder, if anyone needs it, that monetary policy will not always support low borrowing costs. At some point, we will head towards normalization, and we need to worry about that. And for these vulnerabilities, I agree that many of these cannot be fixed by the architecture or deepening EMU. Many of these responsibilities lie at the national level. In your paper, one of the architecture reforms that you think might help fix this is the debt restructuring mechanism, and I'll come back to that. I also very strongly agree that we need to have some guiding principles. We need to avoid moral hazard, permanent transfers, and we need much stronger compliance with the rules and stronger enforcement. Okay. So that's by way of general remarks. Let me start with, I'll go in the order in which you list your ideas in the paper. I'll start with the financial sector. Fully agree that sovereign exposures need some kind of regulation. Nicolas' proposal about concentration limits versus kind of thinking about risk weights. My only suggestion there is that in the paper you should think about expanding this not just to holdings of euro area sovereigns, also other sovereigns. Okay, this is a minor point. Okay. The point I'll make in general is you recognize in your proposals that this transition could be long. It could take a long time to get this new regime in place for the reasons that are well known. In the paper, you say that one idea might be to exempt existing debt. And I fully understand the rationale for that. I want to raise the issue that this is one example in your paper, there are others, but I'll just flag this here, where you make a very strong argument that this reform package that you're suggesting in Jeromin's first slide of the key highlights, in the paper you make a very strong argument that this comes as a package. It all works if you adopt all of this, okay? It doesn't work if you just adopt some pieces of it that you like. Even if there was wide consensus among the member states to adopt all of this, which I doubt, but I'll come back to that. Even if it was, the design of your proposals implies that some of this will take a while. It doesn't come, even if everyone buys in, it doesn't come very quickly. So I think you need to kind of just nuance that argument. Now, I've already made the point in terms of the financial sector that you really do need to pay attention to not just the sovereign bank links, but the links between the sovereign and macro financial links. If you take countries like Italy, for example, where debt levels are high, a lot of debt is held inside Italy but outside the banks. Okay? We need to worry about the vulnerability of those things. And when you have debt restructuring proposals, I think this is quite relevant. On deposit insurance, while I fully support your ambition for pan-European banking, reducing ring fencing, capital restrictions, etc., I was surprised that you water down EDIS. You want the common deposit insurance fund, common funds, or the mutualized part only to be used for large shocks. I think in your paper you say at first resort would be the national compartments, and then you say for large shocks you use. That to me does not strike as a common deposit insurance. I understand fully that mutualization takes time, and it's not going to happen straight away, but the steady state ambition doesn't strike me as a sufficient component of risk sharing. Let me turn to the fiscal architecture. And by the way, if I don't comment on some areas of your financial sector, you can take it that I agree with them. So I'm not focusing on all the issues that you focus on the financial sector. Fully behind your ideas about simplifying the SGP. That's very consistent with the line that the fund has been pushing for a long time. Okay? But a big question mark on your proposal for junior debt. Okay? When I read this, I was looking for, I had obvious questions. I know you want junior debt for market discipline, and you say it automatically gets reprofiled if a country enters into an ESM program, the junior debt part, okay? When I ask the question, will countries issue it? You have an answer in your paper. You say it could be incorporated in national legislation. Compliance would be enforced by the ECJ, so meaning a country could be taken to the ECJ for violating that junior debt issuance proposal. That's a strong. You say the Eurogroup can grant an escape clause in some circumstances. Why is there a better chance than you see now that the Eurogroup would not be sufficiently strict on this? The Eurogroup's history of being flexible, addressing problems as they come, doesn't strike me as strong incentives for the Eurogroup to not liberally grant escape clauses. But my final point on junior debt is, will countries sign up for this? I think, and this is a personal view, it's very unlikely that countries will sign up for this junior debt proposal. And I come back to your original motivation. You say you recognize, and I fully subscribe to that there may be resentment against EU institutions. I just want you to imagine, can you imagine a country being taken to the ECJ for issuing junior debt? Do you think that will give rise to resentment? I think I would worry about that. Okay. Let me come to the next area, which is sovereign debt restructuring. In general, the two areas, supporting sovereign debt restructuring where debt is clearly unsustainable, there's no question. With the proviso that that assessment is always very difficult, okay? In the highest debt country outside of Greece, where some may worry in some scenarios, we see a lot of work, including from the Peterson Institute, that says debt is sustainable under quite a lot of different scenarios. This judgment is not easy. You want to automate it, but I think you have to bear in mind that it doesn't make it easy, and I'll come back to it again. Fully support, by the way, all your ideas about making the process of debt restructuring easier. This is collective action clauses, single limb aggregation. I think that's a good thing, it should help. But the more central question, Jeromin, that you pose in the paper is, will it help make the no bailout clause more credible? Okay. You suggest three aspects in the paper that support your argument that this makes the no bailout clause more credible, and this comes back to you need the whole package rather than simple measures. And you cite three, which are reducing direct exposures of banks to own sovereigns, or having some concentration limit, or containing it in some way. You want to prevent what you call gambles for redemption in terms of economic policy, because countries are worried about the economic and financial costs of restructuring or economic disruptions, as you call them. And you hope that this is more credible, the no bailout clause becomes more credible, because we will, in a better capital market union, see more private risk sharing. On the private risk sharing in the capital market union, we're very fully supportive of it, but I really doubt whether it answers all the questions we're posing for it. Yes, a capital market union would be a big benefit to the euro area. a more integrated capital market could both reduce reliance on banks, which is excessive in Europe. It could reduce the cost of capital for a wider part of the real economy. It could also give many more enterprises access to a much wider capital market than they currently enjoy. Okay? But I really wonder, when we come to debt restructuring issues or countries in serious difficulty, why private sector risk sharing will help. In all other areas where we observe economic downturns and high debts or unsustainable debt burdens, what we observe first is private sector capital fleeing that country very fast. I'm not sure what private sector risk sharing, the insurance it provides you. So I'm still not sure whether your proposals make the no bailout clause more credible. Okay? I agree that this has a little bit more structure than the walk on the Deauville beach, which you cite, but I still worry that it's not. Let me turn to the fiscal area, which is, you have a fiscal capacity for large shocks. Fully support this in principle. We've outlined something very similar, and we'll be coming out with a more specific proposal very soon. Okay? I want to share with you just like where our proposal, which in principle is very similar, may differ from yours. One, we think your scheme is too small, but that we can debate, and that's what, you know. But the trigger or the hurdle to get access to this central fiscal capacity, or your fiscal capacity that you propose, seems to us too high. You have a trigger of a 2 percentage point increase in unemployment, okay? Which, if you look at historically, how many countries go through that and when would they receive, we don't think you will get many recipients. Now, that may be by design, and you have this first loss type of idea, which I understand. The third observation on your central fiscal capacity is that the you want ex-ante higher contributions for countries that are more likely to use it. This, to my mind, I understand fully the logic. This, to my mind, makes it a very hard sell. To buy into a central fiscal capacity where you're told your membership fees are much higher than someone else's doesn't look to me like a kind of politically easy sell. By the way, just so that you know that I fully support the idea, so in our proposal, we also recognize that there are countries that may be heavier users, so to speak. So in our proposal, we have an idea of a usage premium, which is ex post. Okay? It comes to something similar. Okay? But my final observation on the central fiscal capacity is I think you constrain it too much, that you don't want it to have a borrowing capacity. And I think that constrains it a lot. Okay? I know where I can see the motivation, I understand the logic, but this is another example where I think your general ideas are too skewed toward more discipline and less risk sharing. Let me turn in the last section of my comments on your ideas about a euro area safe asset. Okay. Now, Jeromin knows, and some of you may not know, we've been discussing this for a while, and I've raised questions in previous discussions on this proposal by all the authors that Jeromin cited. I asked myself, what were my questions when I was first looking at this 2-3 years ago and discussing it with you? So my questions were then, who would buy the junior tranches? Why is the market not issuing such a securitized asset now? What are the barriers? Are there any barriers? And then my third question was, what is the guarantee that the prices of this safe asset, this securitized asset or tranched asset, prices will reflect the hierarchy of tranches in a securitized structure? And obviously, all of us remember US subprime and how the hierarchy didn't behave in the way we thought. And the other question I have is the fixed portfolio weights that you have. Now, I fully acknowledge that some of these questions that I initially have been addressed. Okay? In particular, the regulatory disadvantage of securitized assets, i.e. the capital charge for holders, will be addressed once you have sovereign assets also are not free to hold. There are concentration limits and so on. So you could put these in par, and it makes the safe asset more attractive. And I can see a limit. But I'm still left with a doubt. I'm not persuaded that it will address and reduce, as you claim, the contagion risk. Okay? If sovereigns lose market access, then their bonds are excluded from this asset, which is by design of your proposal. But what if a sovereign is at risk of losing market access but has not lost market access? Okay? Meaning its borrowing costs are rising. Okay? What happens to the portfolio weights? In your proposal, they remain the same. I find it hard to believe that you would not see a market reaction to that. Okay? So I'm not persuaded by the design of the safe asset for that reason. Okay? Finally, in my notes I must say something about the role of the IMF, because your paper says a lot. Let me just say that there is a lot of discussion about the ESM into the EMF, and your paper has a lot on this, which I fully agree with. I'm not going to disagree with anything in your paper. So all I would say is with regard to the ESM, we have a long history of working very constructively with all regional financing agreements, and the ESM is no different, and I think we will continue to do that. I also remind you that all euro area member countries are independent members of the IMF and always have access to all of the kind of facilities of the IMF. So that's okay. Let me stop there because I want to leave you time to react or other questions. And the bottom line is, I would have preferred a slightly different balance between discipline and risk sharing. And my worry is that because the balance may be a little bit skewed towards discipline, this may not receive sufficient support among many European capitals. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, then, in true European fashion, where you usually need a small member state representative to wrap up a Franco-German proposal, let me invite everyone here at the podium. Before we start, I just have to honor a intervention from Nicolas, who would like to specifically respond to one particular point that Mahmood made, and then we will open it up for questions from the floor.
Mahmood said that from his perspective, our proposal for deposit insurance is not a common deposit insurance, and I want to strongly push back against that. Our system is a system which is unquestionably, unconditionally providing the same deposit guarantee, as I mentioned, to insured depositors in Cyprus, Greece, as in Germany, Finland, Netherlands, or wherever else in the Eurozone. So if that's not a common deposit insurance, I wonder what is. We have the possibility of adverse selection effects in the design of the system, if you think of it as a reinsurance system. So there is a possibility that if a member state has really lousy policies, banks in that member state will choose to operate as branches, not subsidiaries, and therefore there will be branches of banks or subsidiaries of banks headquartered in other member states. I will say that's a feature, not a bug. I think we have the right incentives in the design for it to be stabilizing, not destabilizing. And if the kind of adverse selection I was referring to happens, we think that will be a very strong incentive for the given member state to improve its policies without, and that's a crucial point, endangering financial stability. So really, I think what we have is a common deposit insurance and one with good incentives.
And
so I wanted to react to the two most fundamental points. One is the paper is too German, and the other one is the paper doesn't really address, well, too much biased in the direction of market discipline. And then the other one, do the proposals really meet the standard, which the paper lays out at the beginning, which is to solve political problems, and they probably do not. So Mahmood, I think that on the design of specific proposals, there is indeed a sense that, you can be on a continuum between these poles, risk share, market discipline, or whatever, and you may be able to shift a little bit on this continuum, and then we can argue whether we're in the middle or skewed. So the one point where I would agree with you that, it is that, you could rebalance is on the fiscal capacity, right? Where clearly the decision to take out leave out the borrowing capacity is an example for if you like the Germanic genes of some of these ideas. On the other hand, you could also say, well, on the one extreme you have no fiscal capacity, on the other one you have the full euro area budget, and so we are right in the middle between those, right? So it's a little bit how you make the reference point, but I'd agree that logically one could have shifted this. However, what I really want to point out is that this sense, more broadly, that market discipline gets a lot of emphasis in this paper has to do with a discontinuity. So a limitation, a logical limitation to the extent to which you can rebalance. And this is that at some point you have to decide whether you want to keep the no bailout clause as the anchor of the system or not. And we have decided to do that for the following reason, because we think that logically the alternative to not having it is either full fiscal union, which we think is politically out of reach, but the other is that if you do not embrace the no bailout clause as the anchor, then the default that arises in its absence is either, ad hoc bailouts, or because there is a political limit to these ad hoc bailouts, it's basically euro area exit. The alternative to no bailout to the no bailout clause within the euro area is redenomination risk. And what we saw in Greece was exactly that. So the system, if you do not have the no bailout clause as an anchor and you do not go to full fiscal union, the system would find its own anchor, and that own anchor involves breakup risk. And we do not want to go there. Okay, and this is why we are radical about the no bailout clause. And once you have embraced that, you then really have to think about how am I going to make this work? And then everything else in the paper follows from that. So this was my one fundamental point. A very quick one. You said, why does private risk sharing, sector risk sharing help you? This was the only question that surprised me, because you get more cross-border asset holdings, and so the problem that you referred to, like a lot of Italian debt is held by Italian pensioners and retailers, that's the problem you don't have then, right? So you spread out the consequences of default among the entire euro area, and that makes it easier in terms of not damaging your own country, right? That's the logic, at least. And then the final point, does this help us politically? Does it meet our own standards? So here are the problems. I'm going to give you 4 things, 2 of which we resolve in the paper and 2 which we don't. But I argue the 2 most important ones we actually address. So if the proposals were implemented, we would take the wind out of the sails, out of the main reason for anti-Euro sentiment and one of the main reasons for anti-EU sentiment in countries like Germany. Remember that the Alliance for Germany was created as an anti-Euro party because of a sense that that Germany was the piggy bank for the rest of Europe because the no bailout clause was not credible. So we are squarely focused on, killing that argument. Second, we take out the Syriza, Podemos type anti-Euro resistant, which comes from prolonged periods of austerity. How do we do that? By making the fiscal rules far less procyclical and by taking away the possibility that you're going to have huge protracted gambles for redemption with high debt that involve masses of austerity, right? So these are the 2 pillars of anti-Euro sentiment. They are both addressed in our proposal. Now, what do we not solve? Okay, so the one thing that's not nice about our proposal is that our new fiscal rules rely on technocrats, right? There's the role of the National Fiscal Council. So you can get, if you like, the anti-democracy, the sense that the European Union is not sufficiently democratic, that doesn't get really addressed by our proposals. Okay, so in that sense, it's a weakness. And then finally, there is this sense that, of course, at the end of the day, you have rules, right, like the junior bonds which need to get enforced. But that is the unavoidable bit. Then at that point we have drilled down to the bare minimum, namely that once you create a system that you think is efficient in terms of giving in incentives, of course you need a legal structure that enforces it. And that legal structure in turn needs to be enforced. And for that we will need the ECJ in the background. So that unfortunately we cannot do without.
Now that in good EU manners, France and Germany has eaten up all the time available, let me dictate that we go over time a little bit. And Mahmood, now that you have been ganged up upon by France and Germany, would you like to respond before we open the question?
Just a really quick one, thank you. All I'm saying is, in terms of private risk sharing, my only point would be, just look at who's holding Italian debt now. Just look at what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years. Okay, there is no capital market restriction on any European entity holding Italian debt. Okay, but look at what's happened in Target 2, the widening imbalance. More and more Italian debt is held by domestic residents. When an economy is weak or weakening, or its economic performance, et cetera, doesn't look so good, private capital moves. It doesn't provide you with that risk sharing that you're looking for. That's my only point. And Italy is actually a good example for the debt market. On junior bonds, I did not say this, but I honestly think, unless you really think it's fixing some problem, I would have thought you want to avoid segmentation of government bond markets, that governments are issuing 2 classes of debt. I think that could be politically very difficult, and unless you really think it's helping you fix some problem that can't be fixed without junior debt.
And now we give the audience the opportunity to speak truth to power. So I have many questions. We don't have a lot of time, but we certainly have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, should there be some. That doesn't seem to be the case. The Franco-German intimidation strategy worked like a clockwork. Well, in that case, given that we are at our witching hour, I will not bore you with my many questions. But declare that France gets the last rebuttal to the rebuttal, and that will be the last word.
And of course, that's taking into consideration Mahmood's UK citizenship. So UK doesn't leave Europe, even if it leaves the EU. We know that. So I wanted to go back to this issue of private sector risk sharing, because that's one of the dimensions of the debate, far from the only one, but clearly something important. And in a way, I want to sympathize with Mahmood that right now we don't have that, and that's what I alluded to when I started my presentation, with this vision of a fragmenting financial system in a situation of crisis. And I think we have to get back to that. And again, not to repeat myself, but I'm convinced that Capital Markets Union as a project is very important. I'm also convinced that it's not going to happen anytime soon. So the kind of behavior that Mahmood is alluding to will remain outside of the banking sector. I think, however, if we enforce a system in which the banking system is a channel for integration, not fragmentation, we will have achieved a lot. And from a financial stability perspective, it is actually not irrelevant whether this debt held in Italy is held by Italian banks or Italian non-banks, i.e. insurance companies, individuals, and the like. So it's something special in the banking system, which is the structure of its liabilities, the corresponding risk of a run, which you don't have in direct individual holdings, let alone holdings by insurance companies or pension funds, which are much more sticky. And therefore, I think if we have achieved a situation where the private sector risk-sharing thing is achieved in the banking system, even if it's not achieved in the broader financial system, including capital markets and non-banks, it will be a major achievement in terms of financial stability and shock absorption. And this is exactly what we aim at, particularly with the sovereign concentration charges. So I think the ambition of our proposals in terms of risk sharing, both with again, limiting myself to the area I know best, which is the financial sector, both with the deposit insurance, which is real, and with because you wouldn't have the kind of deposit flight in a single country that we observed time and again, especially in Greece, and in terms of the banking system structure with the elimination of concentrated sovereign exposures, I think that would be extremely significant and should be recognized as such.
I think it's good manner to give our guest the final word, should he wish to have it.
Thank you. Well, maybe 5 seconds. Right? Okay. Please don't get me wrong. We're very, very supportive of a capital market union. My comments today were really aimed at one aspect of what your paper is talking about. Whether debt restructuring, you have a whole range of ideas you want in place to make your proposals about debt restructuring viable or workable. My only question mark is the private sector risk sharing. I don't see as part of that. Okay, private sector risk sharing is a good thing. Capital markets union is a good thing. No questions about it, right? And my comment about Italy was when you see debt levels are high, etc. We have very low interest rates. We have very supportive, accommodative monetary policy, etc. But even in that environment, non-Italians have reduced their holdings of Italian debt. Okay. And that was my target to kind of imbalance whatever point. So I'm just not saying that doesn't give you enough assurance that's, you know, but I'm not against capital market union at all. And I'm not, this is not, Nicolas, this is really not against any idea about sovereign risk weights, concentration charges at all either, okay? That it's not, as I say, in my comments, I did not question that, okay? But thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And with those wise words, I will declare the meeting over. Thank you very much for sticking with us. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.